They said she was temporary, just a replacement server in a base no one remembered requesting. No name on the roster, no transfer papers, just a woman in standard fatigues pouring burned coffee into chipped mugs. The kind of face you forget before she even walks away. No one paid attention until the steam from the cups stopped rising, and 3 conversations died mid-sentence for no reason anyone could name. It wasn't her posture, or her silence, or the way she never asked a single question. It was the ring, worn wrong, on the wrong hand, with the wrong insignia for someone who was supposed to be invisible. The general saw it first. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her knuckles. And in that breath where recognition replaced thought, every SEAL within 10 feet stopped pretending they didn't know what they were looking at. A trident that wasn't regulation. An engraving no one admits exists. And a woman who wasn't supposed to be there, because according to every file on record, she never had been. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us in the comments where in the world are you watching from. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. She didn't serve coffee the way staffers do. She moved like someone covering an operation with a prop in her hand. Nobody looked at her twice, and that was the first mistake. They remembered their conversations changing pitch when she passed, but not the moment she arrived. The room always felt occupied before she crossed the threshold, like the air was adjusting itself around a presence it already knew. No one heard her footsteps, but chairs shifted when she drew near, and conversations that had been careless only seconds before snapped into compliance without anyone understanding why. The logs said she didn't exist, which is how you know she did. One captain swore she'd been at 3 different bases in 2 different countries within a week, but when he tried to file an incident report, his access credentials froze for 48 hours, and came back with a new password he hadn't requested. Someone else said she only ever touched objects that could be wiped down or burned. Metal, glass, ceramic, and the rags she used were always taken away before trash collection. There were no uniforms to trace, no rank pins, no sewn tags. Just a ring no one was supposed to recognize and a silence everyone obeyed. Men who'd been in black sites and ghost units said their spine reacted to her before their memory did. Hands would leave pockets, boots would square up, tone would flatten. The kind of physiological submission you only get from conditioning, not fear. One warrant officer claimed he'd seen her in Iraq in 2008, then in Djibouti 6 years later, unchanged. When he mentioned it over comms, the channel dropped mid-sentence and reconnected like nothing happened. He said her eyes flicked toward the radio before it cut, like she'd heard it before the signal died. There were rumors she was assigned only to rooms that required controlled listening, war briefings, impromptu visits from brass, disciplinary transfers whispered behind closed doors. One sergeant said he remembered her clearing dishes near a colonel who'd been relieved of duty 2 days later without explanation. Another swore she was at Bagram before a security lockdown that wiped 2 entire files from the personnel system, including his own reprimand. He laughed about it once. Only once. The worst part wasn't that no one logged her in. It was that everyone acted like she belonged there right up until the moment their memory tried to prove it. Recognition flickered too late, like a match in wind. The mind rejected the sight because admitting it made the floor under them unreliable. They would look past her, not at her, the way you pretend not to see a classified file left open. And later, when someone dared to ask who she was, the question never came out as a question, just a pause, a breath, and the quiet decision to forget they'd ever noticed. Nobody remembered looking at her hands before that moment. She moved like someone trained to keep her wrists turned, her fingers hidden, letting fabric and habit erase anything that might start a question. But when she leaned in over the general's map, the sleeve shifted just enough. The mug touched wood in a whisper, but the ring landed like a concussion in the back of the mind. Too familiar for strangers, too impossible for anyone to admit they'd seen. The trident wasn't bright. It wasn't new. It had the dullness of metal that's been underground, underwater, or under orders to never exist. The sound it made wasn't volume. It was recognition, like the ear remembering something the eyes refused to process. The first reaction wasn't spoken. It was posture. One lieutenant straightened without meaning to. Another pulled his elbows off the table, and a major who never flinched in mortar fire blinked twice like he'd been hit, with a flash bang no one else saw. There was no announcement, no salute, no demand to explain the jewelry. Just the kind of silence that feels rehearsed across lifetimes. One man in that room had been at Coronado in 2009, and didn't talk about those months unless alcohol forced it. His pupils tightened like he'd just heard the old instructors call a name that never made it to graduation day. He didn't look at her. He looked down, like the floor had become a witness. They say the metal was etched with something the standard issue never carried. Some believed it was a unit mark, others said it was a kill count codename. No one leaned in close enough to read it. That's how you know it was real. The ones who'd been deployed with teams that officially didn't qualify for backup support felt their breathing locked behind their teeth. One captain later described it, not publicly, not in writing, as the same cold he felt when someone tells you a friend is dead in a mission that never deployed. A grief with no obituary, a triumph with no record. That kind of silence doesn't come from confusion. It comes from remembering you signed something that forbade reaction. There were whispers, once, about candidates who never rang the bell and never walked the stage, just vanished off the training grids. Not discharged, not failed, not reassigned. Evaporated into compartments so deep no one even joked about them. Men who'd shared barracks with ghosts would talk about a bunk that was made every morning but never slept in, a name that appeared on a duty roster for a day, then disappeared like a typo no one corrected. Coronado had rooms no one asked about, doors that stayed locked through entire classes, and instructors who would stand silent if you hinted at the shape of the absence. Funny how those same men, who'd buried friends in oceans and deserts, reacted with something closer to reverence than threat. Their eyes didn't widen. Their jaws didn't drop. Their hands just moved slightly away from their weapons, like instinct recognized rank that paperwork denied. You could feel two truths colliding, that no woman was officially forged in that crucible before 2021, and that someone, somewhere, never needed permission to slip into the fire anyway. The fear in the room wasn't of her. It was of themselves, of the part of their memory that knew exactly what that ring meant and had been ordered to forget. Awe only feels like awe when it's braided tightly with the panic of being caught remembering. Nobody spoke his name in that moment, and maybe that's why it hit harder. A man who'd sent battalions into fire without blinking suddenly forgot the choreography of command. He didn't rise from his chair, didn't demand identification, didn't do the thing generals do when something impossible stands in their space. His gaze fixed on her hand like the ring wasn't decoration but a verdict, as if the metal itself remembered him before he remembered himself. The room didn't tense. It sank, like everybody inside it knew instinctively that rank meant nothing if memory stepped through the door wearing skin and silence. There's a particular stillness soldiers learn to fear more than mortars. The kind that happens when someone with clearance no one understands walks in without announcing why they're there. You could see the realization crawl up the spine of officers who'd never taken an unplanned breath in uniform. One colonel shifted his weight like he was trying to stand without drawing attention. A major who once barked orders through a bullet wound lowered his eyes, as if eye contact might trigger something he'd been warned, subliminally or officially, never to invoke. The general's fingertips twitched near the edge of the table, not toward a weapon, but away from any indication he believed he still outranked the moment. They say authority doesn't drain, it transfers. And whatever walked in wearing a coffee carafe and a ring that shouldn't exist carried a kind of weight that didn't need announcement. He didn't ask her name. He didn't verify credentials. He looked at her the way a man looks at a classified briefing he was never supposed to see twice. Somewhere in the back of that room, someone exhaled like they'd been holding their breath since another deployment, another decade. Another night, when orders came from a voice no one logged and no one wrote down. Funny how silence can feel like someone reading your record out loud. There were stories, buried under acronyms and non-disclosure agreements, that certain bases received liaisons no one signed in. They came through kitchens, airstrips, motor pools, always dressed to vanish into the mundane. Some officers claimed they watched clearances outrank stars without a single badge flashed. A few admitted off-record that they once stepped aside mid-command because something older than hierarchy took the room. You don't salute those figures. You don't question them. You remember your posture and pray your name isn't already on whatever list their presence implies. What nobody in that tent would say, but every one of them felt, was that they had seen her before, not in body but in consequence. Missions rerouted without explanation. Operations approved without signatures. Debriefs cut short because an unnamed observer appeared in the transcripts before redaction. Ink swallowed everything. The general's stare wasn't confusion. It was recognition colliding with conditioning, an old directive waking up in a brain that had spent years pretending to forget. When power recognizes something it can't command, it doesn't resist, it recoils. And in that breathless pause, the highest-ranking man in the room wore the same expression as the privates behind him. The quiet terror of remembering too late that rank is just a story told by those still allowed to speak. You said. The cameras didn't blink until after she was gone, and that's how you know it wasn't failure. It was obedience. 6 minutes of footage distorted into static, as if the system recognized something it was trained not to record. The mess hall logs shifted on their own, not wiped clean but rewritten in a way that made her presence look like a clerical illusion. It wasn't deletion. It was redirection, the kind that convinces even the witnesses that memory is the malfunction, not the record. There were names on the roster before she walked in. Temporary hires, civilian aides, contract cooks with clearance levels no one questioned because no one looked close enough. Afterward, those names collapsed into placeholders, letter number strings that don't trigger audits or personnel reviews. Archive scrapes show them for a day, maybe two, before they're replaced by blanks spaced perfectly to avoid suspicion. The kind of edits that don't trip alerts because the system doing the editing is the one that built the alerts in the first place. Budgets don't lie, but they do smother. You can hide an operator under culinary logistics if you pay her like a man with blood on his boots. Combat rates buried under meal service line items. Contractors billing for kitchens positioned on bases without cafeterias. Hazard pay routed through dining facility expenditures during deployments where no food was ever cooked on site. Someone wrote the cover story years before anyone thought to ask the question. Online, the pattern doesn't vanish. It swallows the people who touch it. Threads about female SEAL-adjacent operatives survive just long enough to bait curiosity, then collapse with the precision of a timed charge. Users who post insignia sketches report account locks, not warnings. Mentions of rings with unauthorized Trident modifications trigger mass deletions disguised as spam purges. The posts don't disappear all at once. They dissolve, comment chains first, then headers, then cached previews. By the time anyone tries to recover the links, the platform insists they never existed. There are contractors with NDAs that don't match their job descriptions. People paid to cook who never touched a stove. People assigned to serve coffee on bases that ran automated meal units. People whose per diem matched operators flown into combat zones under blackout manifests. Logistics has always been the easiest place to hide a weapon. Feed the troops, hide the ghost. The worst part isn't how fast the evidence goes dark. It's how willingly everyone lets it. The general signed nothing, said nothing, filed nothing. The men who watched him freeze didn't report an anomaly or whisper a theory. The moment she stepped out of frame, every witness made the same decision without speaking. Protect the gap in the record by pretending they never saw its outline. Obsession doesn't die when the trail ends. It rots into complicity, into the quiet agreement that some truths earn their silence by walking in the front door unannounced. They never said her name, not out loud, not even in the kind of whispers meant to disappear under engine noise and cigarette smoke. But after that day, the air on base carried a different kind of caution, the kind that doesn't come from fear of dying, but from remembering you weren't supposed to live. Men who once treated superstition like weakness started checking reflections in dark windows before turning corners. The ones who made a sport of mocking ghost stories began stepping around empty hallways like something might be listening. Nobody called it belief. They called it discipline. And no one dared point out the difference. You could chart the shift by what stopped being said. The jokes about mystery operators? Gone. The bets about classified myths? Silent. A lieutenant who once bragged about clearing a compound alone started scrubbing his helmet cam before command even asked for it, like he didn't want the footage to accidentally catch what memory already had. Marines who lived through ambushes with no evac support began refusing commendations if their reports mentioned unidentified assistance. They didn't argue, didn't explain. They just pushed the paperwork back across the desk like they knew someone else's name was supposed to be on it. Rumor maps circulated without ever being written. Units continents apart started using the same language without speaking to each other first. Not instructions, warnings. If you see one, don't stare. If she speaks, don't answer. If she acts, don't follow. Just get out of her way. It wasn't policy. It was inheritance. The kind you don't admit exists because acknowledging it means accepting that your clearance stops at the edge of what keeps you breathing. Some of the older operators, men with eyes that never really left the dark, began tracing shapes into the grips of their weapons. Not prayers, not initials, rings, tridents, markings with lines and cuts that don't show up in any SEAL graduation photo. On forums that don't stay public long enough to archive, they talk, not about earning those symbols, but surviving long enough for them to appear in places no one can question, like the inside of a coffin lid that isn't yours yet. The general didn't order new protocols, didn't reprimand or report. But the night after she walked out of that mess hall, he locked his office door before falling asleep for the first time in 12 years. The kind of lock you turn even when no one is coming for you, because maybe they already did once, and letting yourself forget was the only way you stayed sane. No one teased him for it. No one mentioned it at all. Respect has a sound, and this wasn't it. This was guilt learning how to fold itself into silence. The survivors won't say they owe her anything, because that would require admitting she was there. But they carry themselves like men who walked out of a fire someone else stepped into first. They don't celebrate the missions that should have killed them. They don't tell stories when the drinks come out. They just go quiet when the lights flicker, or the radio's cut, or an extra cup of coffee appears on the table without anyone asking who poured it. And in that silence, there's no worship, no fear, just the quiet understanding that some debts don't get named because the ones who collect them don't always come back.